today would be a very interesting show.
Well, and we can't do anything else but lead with this because of the magnitude of the situation, which had been rumored for some time and had been shot down. But yesterday, as we sit here and talk, Hulk Hogan passed away. They said cardiac arrest. He was at his home. He was 71 years old. And I know a lot of people were instantly tweeting at it, why aren't you talking about this? It's been not even 24 hours, I don't believe, since the news came out. And when I heard about it a few hours later, I had a face full of Novocaine from sitting in a dentist chair. So we have tried to regroup and think about this as Best we can. So we don't need to be the news breakers. We are commentators, and we'll try to analyze things a little bit for the good and the bad. But, it surprised me the level of vehemence for the people who had the negative opinion of Hulk Hogan. I figured it would be like, when the big star dies or celebrity or sports figure, even if he was controversial, everybody, kind of goes with it. But is it just social media, Brian? Or for the people who loved him or were fans, they were broken up, and for the people who didn't, they weren't? Is it just Twitter? I haven't talked to anybody personally about it, but what the fuck?
I don't think it's just Twitter. I think Twitter certainly magnifies everything a whole lot more, but it's a complicated legacy. There's the legacy and the life of Hulk Hogan, the character, and then there's Terry Bollea, the person who played the character of Hulk Hogan. And, it's certainly a legacy that's taken a lot of hits, a lot of them self-induced over the last 20 years. But a lot of the reaction I saw, and I know a lot of what I was feeling, because we've had a lot of fun on this show talking about, laughing about the various stories that he would concoct or the things that he would say in these interviews. And of course, there's the infamous tape of him having sex with Bubba the Love Sponge's wife, and then the declarations that he made about himself being a racist afterwards. There's all these things, and there's also at the same time this guy that for a lot of people was the entry to pro wrestling. I became a big fan in '89, and I already knew who a lot of the guys were because of Hulk Hogan's Rock and Wrestling when I was 6, because of the figures that got to the stores when I was 5. I had a Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant action figure before I ever saw them, before I really knew too much about them. And I think for a lot of people, especially my generation, my age group, Hulk Hogan was not only the biggest star of a generation and the face of WWF, but he may be the actual reason you first became aware of wrestlers or wrestling. And I think for a lot of people, the people who still get chills thinking about the Andre the Giant body slam at WrestleMania 3 in '87, the people who still remember the big Saturday night's main events and all the big moments, even the WrestleMania match with The Rock, what a special series of moments that was. It's a tough thing to weigh all of those positive memories and experiences with
I thought Venmo was for paying people.
Yeah, and for everything else.
Everything.
Everything.
the conduct, the words, again, and it wasn't just the Bubba
meltdown.
Yeah, remember, when his son Nick got into that accident, and forgive me for not knowing all the details, the person riding with him was was a vegetable pretty much from that point forward.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a big issue. Then there was a tale of like Hulk Hogan going to the prison and, basically making themselves the victims, not the victim. So I mean, there's a lot of things like that, but again, it's hard. There aren't a lot of examples. He wasn't a murderer like OJ, so you can't really say like, look at when OJ died, but it's hard. I think a lot of the mainstream stuff I've seen is kind of focused on, I don't want to necessarily say the positives, but the realities of the magnitude of his star, but everyone does address the scandals. I mean, he brought down Gawker with that lawsuit that Peter Thiel funded. So it's not like he wasn't always in the middle of stuff, but it's a complicated legacy to kind of weigh.
He learned very well in the wrestling business, the old-fashioned wrestling business, of how to promote himself, make himself bigger, make himself more important in the days when you couldn't just readily poo-poo a bullshit story and didn't realize he had done so much mainstream publicity where the host or the interviewer or the people involved had almost no knowledge of the inside of the business or even the business in general, that he could just say shit, and he got used to that. And then it came back to bite him as far as the stories that we've made fun of and etc. And the books that he wrote that easily, disprovable, but to the kid that was a fan in those days and then didn't know anything about wrestling for 20 years, he buys Hulk Hogan's book and he buys the whole thing. But there's also a third segment. You talked about the people who loved him and were introduced to wrestling, the fans and or the, people on the other side. As controversial as he was, and as many people as he had been involved in at least somewhat double crossing or, creative controlling or maneuvering or whatever, you saw from a lot of people in the business, they loved him. There were people that loved him in the business as well as people who were like, Jesse Ventura.
Yeah, I'll give you a great example because I thought about this. Scott Dickinson, one of the real nice guys out there, former WCW referee, refereed a lot of places, but most famously WCW. Years ago, I forget what you and I were talking about, but we were probably laughing about one of Hogan's things. And he got in touch, and he told me a story, and I was shocked to hear it. And I don't know if shock's the right word, but I was really pleasantly surprised. I don't know what. He said that when Brian Hildebrand, referee Mark Curtis in WCW, got sick, when they found out, I guess maybe the first time, or whenever it was, when they found out that the cancer was really bad, somehow word got to Hogan. And he said that they were surprised when all of a sudden Hogan approached Brian Hildebrand and said, is there anything I could do? I mean, and I think he even did try to get him in with some doctors or something. That's a story that we didn't hear from Hulk Hogan. So it's not like it's a tale that he just made up. It's something I'm hearing from a friend of Brian Hildebrand's.
Well, that's the thing that I always said about the stories that he was telling, is that his real ones were good enough. He was the big mega sensation in the wrestling business. And there's so many, ways you could have told those stories and not been completely full of shit, and Metallica didn't need to be involved or whatever, because the real stuff, he had something to work with. But that's why, very complicated. And I know I've even had people on Twitter the last day say, I can't wait to hear Cornette and Last roast Hogan now that he's gone. I'm like, have we ever been personally mad at each other? You and I and him? We laughed at the bullshit, but he was a big deal in the wrestling business. Now, I wasn't a fan of him being a big deal in the wrestling business while he was a big deal in the wrestling business, because I was on the other side. And it's no secret I was not a fan of the Vince Jr.'s WWF ideas for the 80s with the kiddie program and et cetera, because we were in the NWA and that was wrestling. And, so it was not my cup of tea. I was on the southern side while they were on the northern side. But the thing, actually, I don't think people realize, and I've said it before, that I would say that I have probably
been in the same room like 10 times. Right? Something to that effect?
I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this properly. I've been in the same room with Hulk Hogan in my life like 8 fucking times, maybe. So I had no positive or negative personal interaction with him ever. I think 5 or 6 of those were when I was the photographer in Memphis and he was here in 1979. I took the pictures. Then once was at the NAPTE convention, the National Association of Television Program Executives in New Orleans, I believe, in 1991. And we passed greetings as he was at a booth and I was at a booth. And that may be the last time ever. So the point is, I'm not going to crow about it. He finally got what was coming to him. Because I barely ever met the fucking guy. But you were a fan as a kid. I was not a fan as a kid because I'm older. I was a kid before he was in the business and a fan. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But we have always acknowledged the magnitude of the money that he drew. And the fact that, remember when we were talking about Flair, I said we were talking about the #1 box office attraction of the year every year in the 90s or in the 80s. I said, well, it would have been Flair if it hadn't been for Hulk. It would have been Flair if it hadn't been for Hulk. Like 7 years in a row or whatever. And I don't know there's differences between being the biggest box office attraction and the biggest mainstream star. And sometimes you might be able to be both at the same time. But as in terms of biggest box office attraction in wrestling, besides, nobody's ever going to top Jim Londos because that was a completely different generation. And everything was different. But since then, who would have been, for a short period of time, Austin and Rock drew more money, but a much shorter period of time.
Locally, Bruno was obviously the biggest thing ever, but we're talking about someone who on a national stage, with some ebb and flow at a certain point in the early 90s, but for 20 years was the biggest drawing card and the most recognizable pro wrestler in the world.
Well, and even Gorgeous George, while he, at one point, the name Gorgeous George, then the image of the blonde guy, Gorgeous George, because of the early network TV, more people may have known who he was at a period of time in this country, but he didn't draw the money and it didn't last nearly as long. And I mean, don't let anybody say Cornette said Gorgeous George didn't draw money, but he flopped in New York. But I'm talking about Gorgeous George more became a celebrity because Bob Hope and everybody on television was also talking about him. And it was in Hollywood where they all saw him, and it was all over TV in Los Angeles, as we've talked about.
And it was the early days of TV. There were only a few channels, and wrestling was one of the most watched things on American TV at that time.
So as far as at the gate, and take Londos, and Londos was a bigger mainstream star because people had to read the fucking newspaper every day. There was no television or whatever. But take him out of it, and, it's got to be Hogan. And Bill Longson was a big draw in the 40s when everybody else was in the Army. So that's why I think it for a lot of people, it's been kind of sad. The ones that really liked him and were fans, or probably even the guys that liked him, his friends in the business, probably at some point were rolling their eyes at all the things he was getting into that were, it's ended up like it has, where there's memes of Hogan walking through the pearly gates and there's God and he's black. And it's like, what? Jesus, that's harsh for a guy who never actually fucking went to jail for fucking anybody up or anything.
It's the fact that he said on the tape that, we're all racist, or I'm a racist to a point. Whatever he said, it was a declaration.
You want to see what's right for you. With a personalized feed, you do.
That he never walked completely. I mean, when he made the big apology, WWE locker room, again, a lot of wrestlers.
Well, he did. It wasn't an apology. It was a warning. Don't get caught saying stupid shit.
Be careful on social media was like his message.
Don't let them know what you really think.
So, I mean, that's where, people really lose it for Hogan. There are a lot of fans out there who really, really grew to dislike him because they grew up feeling the opposite way. And then all of a sudden there's a secret video of him throwing the N-word around, saying things about his daughter dating an African-American, and then declaring himself a racist while cheating on his wife or whatever it was with the guy's wife who was filming. I mean, the whole thing. Well,
come on now. To be fair, with what we've learned about his wife afterwards, wouldn't you been trying to fucking find another goddamn country to live in or something?
Well, the point is, it was all out there, and Hogan, I don't know how big things would have been. Let me rephrase that in English, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know if an apology, a genuine, heartfelt one, would have changed everyone's opinion, but it would have gone a long way, especially amongst people in the wrestling business. Because that's the other thing you started seeing was a lot of, like, let's say, the contemporary WWE wrestlers. AEW, remember AEW banned Linda Hogan, and it wasn't like the people there weren't thinking, Hulk Hogan too. They got to a point where the modern generation of wrestlers was offended by him, was offended by him being around.
Well, that's why I mentioned I would have to think that a lot of the guys from his generation that were friends and liked him were rolling their eyes and like, please, Hulkster, give us something to work with, every once in a while, and don't get in some of these deals.
But you mentioned the 80s before and Ric Flair. To me, it's like those are the leaders of that generation, and we just lost one. And again, they've all had a fall from grace in one form or another, but when you look at Hogan, Flair, and Vince, like, to me, those are the three monumental figures.
Jesus Christ, now that you just said that, I'm sorry, but now that you have just said that, and we see 40 years ago, if you had said, well, here's what's going to happen to these three,
yeah,
they'd have fucking put you in a rubber room, and it's happened.
Yeah. Now, you brought up before, you've only been in a room with Hogan a few times. I'm guessing the first time you were was maybe the most impactful. Did you take his very first promo photos?
I can't. I took the very first ones and probably the only ones that were taken in the Memphis territory. But now, here's the thing. They broke him in Florida, as everybody knows. We're not going to... I'm sure you can find another podcast to give you chapter and verse, but we're trying to make this somewhat first-person accounts. They broke him in Florida and in 78, and he worked under a mask down there. So I don't technically know if he'd had any pictures taken of him barefaced because he was the Super Destroyer or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So then they booked him in Alabama. Louis Tillett was the booker at that point in time. And was it Continental?
Not yet.
It wasn't even Continental yet. It was still Southeast.
It was Southeastern, and it was just when they had opened up the Alabama end because it was in Knoxville, and then Ron Fuller opened up the second part of the territory.
And so it used to be the old Gulf Coast territory and the fields and et cetera. But nevertheless, because it was next door to Florida, so they booked him over there, and about 6 weeks later is when Jared booked him up here. Well, and See, here's the thing. At that point in time, in April, May of 1979, Robert Fuller was still booking Memphis for Jarrett. And he used a lot of the Knoxville crew because it was the other end of the state. But since Knoxville was affiliated with Continental, they heard about this big blonde guy they had down there in Pensacola and said, well, let's bring him up because Lawler had a deal. Mongolian Stomper was Southern Shane. Lawler was working with him. Gorgeous George Jr. was the Stompers' manager. And so Lawler brings in a mystery wrestler into the Mid-South Coliseum to face the Mongolian Stomper for the title. And it turns out to be Terry Boulder, Terry the Hulk Boulder. And then the next week was a tag team match with Lawler and Hulk against Stomper and Gorgeous George Jr. And they brought him to Louisville, I believe, at the same time for a week or two. And then he went back down to Continental. But I had gotten a couple of pictures of him then as the Lawler came back about 6 weeks later.